Flood tide below me, I watch you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high. I see you also, face to face. And so it was that by some frolic of nature, a cluster of rocks formed themselves on the side of a mountain. A cluster of rocks that had the very semblance of a face. There was the wide arch of the brow. There was the long bridge of the nose. And there were two flat stones, ochre-colored, each large enough to crush a whole house. But up there on the side of the mountain, they looked like a pair of soft lips opening to speech. Now get too close, and you would see above you a menacing cluster of rocks above your head. But in a distance, there you saw it, that face with the benign smile, looking protectively over the valley below, the great stone face. Now in that valley below, there was a boy who was sitting on the front steps of his house. And behind him was his mother, who with a broom was sweeping the porch. And the boy looked up dreamily at that face on the side of the mountain, the great stone face. And as he did so, his mother looked at him, and for a moment put her broom aside, and she said to her son, "My boy, there's an old legend that dates back to the time of the Abenaki people, the people who lived here before us. A legend that tells that one day someone with the very likeness of the stone face will return to our valley." Well, the boy turned to his mother and he said, "Ma, do you think I will get to see that?" And then his mother took up her broom and began to sweep, and with a deep sigh she replied, "Perhaps, my son, perhaps." And she continued sweeping, as if to sweep away all the disappointments from her life. But from that day forward, the boy could not look up enough at the great stone face above him, high up on that mountain. Every day he would run into the field, and in the middle of the field he would look up at that face. He wouldn't play with the other boys. Any spare moment he had, there he would be seen, looking up aimlessly at that face on the mountainside, looking up at the great stone face. And then there came a time that there were news. There was news in the town that one of the sons of the valley who had left for sea long ago was returning as a very rich man. He had made his fortune in the city, and he had decided that he would live the remainder of his years in that valley, build his great town home there, and with it bring all his money. The townspeople spoke among themselves, thinking this was a very good thing. Money coming into the valley would mean more jobs, more houses, maybe even the railway would finally pass through their valley. And then the day came that in the town hall all was set up with ribbons, and they were waiting for the carriage of the great rich man, the financier, formerly the son of the valley, to return in triumph. And there were the young children with their well-scrubbed faces and flowers in their hand, waiting to greet the great financier on his return. The crowds were gathered, and they were talking in anticipation, for they wanted to glance upon this person who would be their valley's greatest benefactor, And as he descended from his carriage, they saw a man whose skin had turned yellow, so yellow it seemed like it had Midas's touch to it, and wrinkles and very small eyes. But all the crowd who was gathered there were mumbling among themselves, Don't you think that he has the very likeness of the stone face? The boy who was there wanted to get a glance himself, but all the grown-ups around him were so tall. So somehow he pushed himself between two grown-ups and had a good look at the financier. But he only had to look into his eyes for but one instant to know what the people were saying wasn't true. And with a heavy heart, the boy said to himself, Alas, it is only a legend. And what is a legend after all but a lie? But at that moment he looked up at the great stone face on the side of the mountain. And what was left of the morning mist seemed to soften the contours of that stone face. He almost imagined those lips speaking to him, saying this, One day you will understand. One day you will understand that the prophecy has already been fulfilled. And so the financier built his big home in the valley. And everyone who lived there was waiting for all the good things to happen that came with money. But after a while, the stories from the city leaked out into the valley. The stories saying that the financier had only settled there to escape his creditors. And the great house he was building was never completed, for by then his creditors had caught up with him, and the financier had breathed his last a few months later with not a penny in his pocket. Now some years passed after that, and by then the young boy was already a man just entering adulthood. He was known as Ernest, that solitary fellow Ernest who always spent time by himself. Oh, he was a hard worker, but every spare moment, the young man Ernest could be seen in that field, that same field he spent all his time as a boy, always standing in that field looking up at the great stone face. Now there were stories that the young man had a girl in another town, but no one ever saw any evidence of this. And so they were resigned that young man Ernest, after all, would spend the rest of his life alone. And so the years passed more after that. His temples were already getting some gray to them. And it was around this time that there was a story that was told of one of the sons of the valley who had left the valley long ago to enter the army. And he had participated in many wars. And the evidence of this was all the ribbons that were on his chest, for he had become a general. And it was told that the general would return to the valley, and he would bring peace and order to a valley, the valley which itself had been threatened by all the crime that was happening in the rest of the world. A good thing, the townspeople thought, to have a man in iron in our town, to keep order and to keep lawlessness away. And so the day came. The day came when the town hall once again was decked with ribbons, and there was a brass band playing out in front to greet the return of one of the sons of the valley, to greet the arrival of the general. And so the crowd who was there waited in anticipation. And finally, when the carriage arrived and the general descended from his carriage, everyone started talking among themselves. "Can't you see," they said, "can't you see that our old son of the valley, this general, can't you see he has the very likeness of the great stone face?" Well, Ernest, who was among them, who was tall but not as tall as all the young men who were surrounding there, wanted to get a look himself. "How tall youngsters grow these days," protested Ernest himself. But still he pushed his way among the crowd so he could have a look himself. And he took one look at the general, at his sunburnt face, and those large, dark eyes that had no feeling in them. And Ernest felt a heaviness in his heart as he said this to himself: "Alas, it was only a legend. And what is a legend, after all, but a lie?" But at that moment, when he looked up at the mountain face in the midday sun, the bright light of that hour of the day seemed to play tricks with the stones that made up the great stone face. It seems like the cheeks were moving in the shadows and light of the midday sun. And as it did so, Ernest imagined that it was saying this to him: "One day you will understand. One day you will understand that the prophecy already has been fulfilled." Well, the general settled himself in the valley. There were plans to organize a police brigade, to create law and order in the town. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, for the general to announce his first orders. But the general retreated quietly to his home. And any time anyone greeted him at his door, there was a foul smell on his breath, for he had spent all the day drinking. And then it was understood that the general had come to the valley, for he had been charged with conduct unbecoming, and he retreated to the valley to hide his shame. And with drink he descended, trying to run away from a shame that would never leave him alone, until drink took his life away. And the years passed after that. But there was Ernest working his farm as he always did. His hair was getting grayer and grayer as the years passed, but his energy was still there. An energy as if he was waiting for something. The world changed around him, but everyone seemed to feel that Ernest never changed. He used the same tools he used years ago, had the same routine. He always lived alone, ever since his mother died. And ever since then, nothing seemed to change in his life. The same hard work and the same spare moments in that same field, looking up at the great stone face. And some more years passed after that. And then there was a professor in a university in the great city who was engaged in studies of folklore. And he had heard about this strange man who lived in the valley, who had lived the same way he had always did for years and years. Well, this intrigued the folklorist. He wanted to speak to this man, have him share his memories, have him talk to him to see whether he used the old expressions. And then the professor made his way to the door. And Ernest greeted him. And when he entered Ernest's home, it was as if it was just as everyone had said to him. For Ernest had lived the same way for years and years. The inside of his home had everything that had gone out of date years ago. There weren't much luxuries in there, for the only luxury that Ernest allowed himself were books. Books of poetry that lined his mantel. And that's what the professor first noticed. All those books of poetry, dog-eared with their spines almost torn apart from being opened too much. And there was Ernest, talking in a language that the professor had not heard in over 30 years. And he had Ernest talk about his thoughts, and his thoughts and dreams were the thoughts and dreams that the professor's own grandparents had. It was as if nothing had changed for Ernest all these years. Well, he was so fascinated with Ernest that once he went to town, he spoke to his friend the poet. For Ernest had one of his books of poetry on his mantel. And the professor told the poet about this strange man who lived in the valley. And this intrigued the poet so much that he decided he would take time away from his tours of all the great cities of the world, Paris and London and Berlin. And he would make a special trip to the valley to make a public reading, though his real intention is he wanted to see this man, this strange, interesting man everyone called Ernest. Now when Ernest heard that one of his favorite poets was making a visit to his own valley, and that there was going to be a public reading on a podium right outside the town hall, Ernest's heart began to race with anticipation. And then the day came. By the time the podium was set and the crowd was gathered, the sun was just about to set. The poet was already on the podium, his lectern in front of him. The page open to the poem he was going to share with the crowd who was there. But Ernest had not yet arrived, and they waited. For some reason, Ernest was late that day, and when he arrived out of breath, he apologized. He apologized to the crowd. He didn't have even the courage to approach the poet. And then he made his way to find a seat. But the poet looked in the crowd, and he saw that face of that man they called Ernest. And that face intrigued him. And so before he read his poem, he told the story to the crowd about the professor, and how the professor had mentioned this man called Ernest. And at that moment, he asked that man to come forward so he could greet him, for after all, it was because of him he had made that reading. All the crowd began to applaud Ernest, and indeed he was shy, for until then it seemed like no one really noticed him, and he wasn't used to all the fuss and attention that was given to him at that moment. But somehow he mustered the courage to rise from his chair, walk down that aisle that led to the podium, and he started walking up towards the podium. He made his way to the steps that led to the top of the podium. And at that moment, the sunset was giving its pink, brilliant light of the end of the day. And as Ernest was climbing up those steps, somebody from the crowd cried out, "Look, don't you see? Don't you see that the great stone face has arrived?" When everyone looked around, they saw how the pink light played its magic on the face of Ernest. And indeed, at that moment, His face had the very resemblance of the great stone face. When everyone saw this, they began to weep. They began to weep, for they could not believe that this legend could ever come true. And who would have thought that after all it would have been none other than old man Ernest, who lived alone on his farm? And through cries and weeps, Ernest became very embarrassed. He still didn't understand the fuss. And he turned to the poet. And the poet had tears that were streaming down his eyes, for he full well understood, for he full well saw the likeness that everyone else saw. For everyone saw it, except Ernest. Well, Ernest tried to calm the crowd. "Please, good people," he said, "this poet has come from far away to share his poetry with us. And indeed, we can do none other than offer him our ears." And the crowd was so mystified that at that moment they became silent. And Ernest took his place back on his chair, and the poet read his poetry amidst a silence where you could hear a pin drop. The reading was over, and still it seemed that nobody got over what they had seen that evening. It was already starting to get dark, and as the poet approached his carriage, he begged Ernest to join him in his carriage, where he would ride him all the way to his doorstep. And when they arrived at the doorstep of Ernest's home, Ernest, rather shyly, said his farewell to the poet, thanking him for the honor of sharing his poetry with his town that evening. But still the poet followed him to the door to make sure he would arrive home. And then Ernest turned to the poet and smiled at him. Still then he didn't understand what the fuss was all about. And the poet, his eyes still glassy with tears, smiled at him and wished him a good evening. And then Ernest entered his home alone, prepared himself to go to sleep. And that evening he had a deep sleep. And in his sleep he had a dream. And in his dream he heard a voice that said this to him: "Don't you understand, dear Ernest? Don't you understand that the prophecy has already been fulfilled? For I am you, and you are me. And the long loneliness between us, after all, is only an illusion that will disappear at the end of this long, dark night. That will disappear at the end of this long, dark night." And then Ernest fell back into a deep sleep, and he slept and slept until the end of that long, dark night. Flood tide below me, I watch you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high. I see you also, face to face.